On behalf of Jane's family, I'd like to express our sincere gratitude to all of you, especially all of those that have travelled to be here and at such short notice. I think Jane would be pretty impressed to see so many of you come here to be with her family today as we honour her and celebrate her life. We have shared as friends many wonderful memories and wonderful moments with Jane. I think she'll be loving the fact that it's a lovely evening. The birds are naturally singing in the trees for her. And this spot meant so much to her as well. At the conclusion of this service here, we're going to go across to the Malden Cemetery where Jane is to be naturally buried in her family grave. The plan was to be Sunday here with afternoon tea in between all of that, and that would have been lovely to do. But when you go home, I'm sure, have a drink and have it for Jane. But as we open this tribute here to Jane, I'd like to invite some of those many people that Jane's life has touched through the many compartments of her journey in life. They're going to lay some symbols as tributes, as these reminders. Firstly, the kettle, or a teapot. Someone's got that here, on its way up. This is a reminder that her kettle was always on for a cuppa and a chat to whomever came to visit. Her apron. Where's her apron? Hardly ever seen without one. Useful at any time, anywhere, and Jane was the one who was prepared to just put on that apron, hop in and help. Jane's hat. She was always sun smart and just loved wearing hats, and also her beanies. Jar of jam. A very enthusiastic and persuasive cook, able to come up with many exciting wonders. Knitting. This represents Jane's creativity. Not just a knitter, but a very creative lady in all that she did in her life. A face mask. Jane made these, and it was, to her, just another way that she could help protect her community. The binoculars. These were so great for her bird watching, one of her loves here in the Nuggeties and beyond. And today, donations to BirdLife Australia in Jane's memory would be much appreciated. One of Jane's awards, which Tusker's wearing. This recognised Jane's work, her passion, her love for the environment. Sorry, that's the Environmental Award. A calendar and a book. These represent Jane's devotion in recognising and preserving our local history for many future generations to learn from and to enjoy. A toy. This is a symbol of the work Jane did in helping our younger members and their families with that pop-up playgroup. Now Jane's nursing badge. This is the one Tusker's wearing. Even though this badge was given to Jane for her work with those who needed care, it did not stop at just the sick, the old or the frail. Jane nursed everything, and her love for people, for animals, nature, the environment was second to none. And finally, a nest and a plant. These two things surely say it all. The nest, a home, warmth, a safe place to be, the right person to be in your nest. The plant, to grow with, to learn from, to shelter under. All of these symbols today are from compartments of Jane's life, and they remind us all of her love, her care, her community, compassion, and her very giving heart. Jane was an inspirational human whose love for life is evident by the number of people that are here today, who've come to pay homage to a mother, a sister, an aunt, a community leader, and as our friend. Her story begins on the 17th of February 1955, where she was born to Lorna and Albert, better known as Bert, Mitchell. She was born at the Royal Women's Hospital in Carlton. She was born the second to older brother David, following by Tim, or as Jane affectionately described him, Timbo, who came 9 years later after Jane was born during an era where her parents, Bert and a draftsman and Lorna a homemaker and Scrabble extraordinaire, afforded her the opportunity to explore the world as a child, and to explore it she did. As a younger girl, Jane's lifelong friend Carol moved 4 houses away in Friendship Square at Cheltenham, and the two met at Brownies. Whilst both girls were incredibly different, being it was never a barrier to their lifelong friendship. Jane and Carol's family spent a lot of family holidays together. Jane was often sick off the side of the boat with the motion of sickness, but she never once complained. It was never about Jane, it was always about everybody else. Being present in the moment and making time for others always. Carol recalls Jane's sense of curiosity and the natural world that led many explorations that were known as Jane's Jolly Jaunts. I wonder what's around that hill. I wonder what that plant or bird is. Her sense of curiosity and wonder was like an engine inside Jane, and that's what drove her. She was always drawn to history and liked exploring cemeteries. And one of the best things Jane would say was, the best things in life, they're free. Jane always wore sturdy walking shoes and was always up for a walk, rain, hail or shine. There was no excuse. All her life, Jane simply loved the clouds, the water, the sand, the soil. As a child, Jane lived life to the fullest, be it calisthenics, twirling that baton with pride, or badminton matches against David in the backyard, finding and housing rabbits, kittens or a tortoise, and exploring her love for market gardens, one known as Retreat House in Cheltenham. Jane referred to it as a fairyland, and it was full of hedges and roses. Jane and Carol would smuggle flowers home for Lorna, and Lorna never once asked where they came from, which was probably for the best. Described by school friends as born wise, Jane loved the older folks. Carol recalls at 10 years of age, the two of them, at Jane's insistence, regularly heading over to visit Carol's Auntie Peg, crossing the main road to do so for the stories and for the scones. Jane would also visit her grandfather, William Mitchell, who was getting on in life and struggling with everyday self-maintenance, which led to slight grumpiness. So Jane, in her wisdom, would clean the windows so he had a brighter view of the world outside. Don't worry about the filthy stove needing TLC. His view of the world was the key to living life. Jane loved the stories that the old folk told. Little did she know at that time, but her later life, working life, in social counselling was linked to her passion for people's stories. Jane's lifelong friend Diane recalls, Lindsay and I met Jane in third form, which is year 9, when we all took the commercial all-girls year group. If you didn't plan for uni, that's where you often ended up. Through Jane, I finally felt part of a tribe in that schoolyard and not just an outsider. She was tall with long blonde hair, a big confident personality with a Norse Valscari, and she stood out in the crowd. Her voice could project easily across the schoolyard, a natural fit with drama groups and debating teams. She took part in all of them. Lewis Porter, a year ahead with Carol, was her great friend in the acting drama group performing A Town Like Alice, and to great applause. Her great strength was connecting with people even there back then. And reflecting back, I would say she drew many loner personality types to her, and that included me. She was outgoing enough for all of us. As Jane grew up and got her driver's licence, she purchased her first car, which was a little Morris Minor, and it had the number plate with a HLC. And that number plate affectionately referred to, Jane called it, her happy little car. Jane moved to a flat in South Yarra and accumulated parking fines galore. She claimed she was in the right, as parking on the nature strip shouldn't be counted. Her logic was appreciated by the local council, otherwise, though less unfortunate for her pocket, I'm sure. Whilst working in the pancake parlour, Jane studied nursing and officially started practising in 1978. When Timbo was 16, he would visit Jane during the school holidays and they formed a very close bond, including her own circle of friends who became and welcomed Tim. And Tim fondly recalls lots of walks, assisting in the garden, out for tea and lots of stories. During Jane's 20s, Jane had met Vince Jacobs, and on the 23rd of October 1978, they were blessed with the birth of Jane's first child, Mitch. They lived in Alphington, where Mitch was home birthed and simply adored. Fiercely independent like his mum, Mitch was a free spirit, which was highly encouraged by Jane. Jane was so proud of his adventurous spirit and gentle temperament. Jane and Vince decided a country life was the life called for them. And they moved to Malden, where they purchased a house with a mutual friend, Steve Nicol, and his partner, Alicia. Now, Jane and Oz, they first met as friends in 1978 through Steve, who was working as a blacksmith at the time and had a stall at the market in Malden selling his products. Oz also had a stall at the same market, and Steve and Oz met through their common interest in that blacksmithing. And over the next few years, Jane and Oz got to know each other better. And as both of their respective relationships began to fail, this gave them something in common. And they found they were beginning to find great support in each other. Shortly after this time, Jane bought herself some land on the outskirts of Malden, and with the help of Oz and some other friends in 1980, moved a disused railway carriage onto the block. There's a lovely photo of it up on the board up there. I remember it coming up to Malden. which Jane set to turning into a cosy dwelling and the creation of her first garden. Around the same time, Oz relocated out to Eddington to become closer to work in Malden. But this also gave Jane and Oz an opportunity to spend more time together. Shortly after this, Jane and Oz's friendship grew into relationship. And over the next few years, that relationship continued to grow with Jane and Oz, spending more time with each other at their respective houses. Oz and Steve also built a new blacksmith shop together in the main street of Malden, the Malden Blacksmith Shop. Now, while Jane continued to raise Mitch, and this continued until 1983, when Jane discovered she was expecting another child. It was due to this, and with Mitch almost ready to start school, it was decided that living together would be a more practical option. Jane and Oz found a house on the outskirts of Malden up here in the Nuggeties. They thought would be nice, but unfortunately they were told it was not possible financially. But the bank manager didn't tell them that the house next door was due to go on the market very shortly. Later that year, Jane and Oz bought that property. Before they could move into the house, Tusker was born. He was born in November of 1983 at the Castlemaine Hospital. Tuss, as Jane affectionately referred to him, he was a beautiful child who never stopped smiling. Mitch and Tuss's bond was strong from day one, and Jane simply adored watching them grow up into the gorgeous human beings that they are today, and spoke to all who would listen about how proud she was of them, however big or small their accomplishments were. Now, that new house was a small 2-bedroom fibro house that had seen better days and was in the middle of a dry and dusty 2 acres, but was situated in a valley halfway up the hill with endless views to the north. Before any major renovations and upgrades could be made to that house, Jane learned she was expecting her 3rd child. In August of 1986, Clara was born. Clara was named after Jane's grandmother. At 15 years of age, Jane said to her grandmother, "If I have a daughter, I will name her after you," because she loved her grandmother so much, and she did name her daughter Clara. With 3 children now in tow, it was obvious some work would need to be done on that old house. So over the next 30 years, Jane and Oz turned that small house into a 3-bedroom stone palace and the 2 acres into the Garden of Eden. In 1988, Jane returned back to nursing, and Oz had sold the blacksmith shop to start Nuggety Welding. At this time, Jane's mother-in-law, Joan, played a pivotal role taking care of the children while both parents were at work. Jane was a great one to encourage joining the community, whether through the cactus group or land care, or whatever would fit the person. She was a strong advocate for participation and making a difference in local community. She was very persuasive and made you think you should get involved for the greater good, and she certainly would give it a go in convincing you all the time. But by the mid-1990s, Jane had grown tired of her nursing, and she commenced studies to become a welfare worker. On successful completion of her studies, Jane commenced work for Bendigo Health. She was working at the Anne Cordell Centre in the rehabilitation department. Here Jane made many close and important friends. She worked in the role for over 10 years before being offered a position as a case manager, first based out at Inglewood and then over at Maryborough. But around this time, Jane bought a flat and had moved into Bendigo. While this was beneficial for Jane being closer to work, it also proved to be a wonderful time in her and Oz's relationship. With spending time apart during the week, Oz fondly remembers treasuring their weekends together. But after a few years in Bendigo, Jane sold the flat, returned to her garden and her house in the Nuggeties. By the early 2000s, Jane's mother Lorna, she was ageing in health, and it did become a bit of a decline. Jane made a difficult yet unselfish decision to give up work and to be with Lorna as a full-time carer. Jane described it beautifully as a privilege. During this time, Jane had that opportunity to explore the op shops and Chelsea, which she very much enjoyed. And this period of time also triggered her passion for family history, and she would reconnect with doormat family connections, taking Lorna to the RSL to connect with the oldies, to family and to hear their stories. It became a huge focus and a fun project for Jane. Reconnecting with the past, yet also connecting with the UK family and forming more strong family connections. When Jane's nephew Oscar Mitchell was born, with younger brother Tim and wife Lex, Jane absolutely adored the tiny human, and playing the role of grandma more than an auntie, and just loved the concept of the family growing. As they lived in the city, Jane felt it was her duty to introduce nature, and she would visit with a box of nature seeds and pods, etc., to delight him every visit. She would arrive with books, windmill toys, take him on adventures or op shops, trinkets, to give new experiences that were different from what he was getting from his mum and dad. She would have a sleepover night once a week, so Lorna could connect when there was 4, and they would arrive for dinner on a Sunday and would stay overnight. And Lex would pick him up on the Monday afternoon over a period of about 6 months. They had such a wonderful time, but selflessly, Jane worked incredibly hard on that connection. With Lorna, such as discussing piano, a passion of Lorna's, knowing that Lorna was not long for the world. Jane continued as Lorna's carer until 2014, for about 4 years, by which time Lorna had declined to a point where she required that full-time care. Lorna was moved into care up here in Malden, and Jane moved back out to here at Nuggety. And in 2015, Lorna sadly passed away, and Jane was off to save the world in other ways. Jane was the most thoughtful human known to all of her friends and family. And Diane says, Jane had a way with words. I always admired her cards, always had a personal note that spoke to you, as she knew you. My last received this January was birthday, when I saw Jane on the 23rd, encouraging me in my creative pursuits. It was a hot day, spent indoors around the kitchen table, and after catching up with the family and other events, conversations turned inevitably to topical subjects, a robust conversation as ever. I was sent away with jars of jam and a small quince grown from seed, from her quince tree at Nuggety. It will be Jane's tree in my garden. In 2000, her brother David and mum Lorna arrived in Rome, to younger brother Tim and his wife Lex on a once-in-a-lifetime European adventure, and Jane's first adventure overseas. They all had Christmas in Tuscany, and the snow was gracefully falling like something from a fairy tale. David and Jane stayed for 6 extra weeks, and at that time it was an incredibly important, healthy family reconnection and a healing time. helping her mum walk up steep hills, reading stories to each other at night. It was a wonderful and simply incredible trip. Her brother David recalls in Siena at St Francis, Jane accidentally spilt nuts into the crypt, and the local woman gasped and announced it was a sign. Jane stumbled across a place known as Bomarzo in a book which had a very secret garden. Jane convinced her brothers to join her on a day adventure and had the lads catching a train in the middle of nowhere, then walking for miles and miles. Jane's brother recalled, when we finally arrived, it took our breath away. It was absolutely amazing and well worth that trip. While staying in the village of Cortona, it was a complex transport system, with it being at the top of a steep hill. And Jane walked into the bakery at the bottom of the hill and she yelled at the top of her voice with bent knees, pleading if they would understand English, asking how do we get the bloody hill, up this bloody hill with our luggage. And everyone just stood there staring with their mouths open. The family ended up walking halfway up, and thankfully a bus came and the family fondly recalls them picking them up. Tim and Lex recall, everywhere we went we found great places. The street life and staying in places for 3 or 4 days. It was a little farce though for Jane, where everywhere Jane went she wanted to implant roots and connect with the community. She wanted to participate everywhere she went, something she struggled to rush with. And it's just not how she was wired. But after Austria and Switzerland, Jane and Lorna reluctantly went home, departing from Zurich. Jane's first time overseas and sharing in her mum's love of travel. But this it kicked off a number of trips and gave her the confidence to explore the international world more. Her dear friend Lindsay recalls from her 2017 overseas trip, we have shared many of life's journeys, but this journey was precious beyond words. Jane and I were first planning our overseas trip in our somewhat unruly high school history classes that dear Miss Hillhouse taught. Jane would train as a nurse and I intended to teach domestic science. Then we would travel on aboard ship and make use of our skills, but life had taken us in different directions. 40 years on, Jane asked if I'd like to be her travel companion. She was keen to trace her ancestral heritage and reconnect with family and close friends, and similarly for me, to go back to my birthplace in Scotland, in the Highlands. We tramped in the hills of Scotland and Wales. We visited museums and galleries, grand manor homes and castles. We strolled through many magnificent parks and gardens in Britain, drinking in the beauty of flowers and trees, and it was wonderful. Diane recalls Jane showing me beautiful journals, one she'd created with photos and notes of people and places, and great memory album of her travels. She spent many hours reflecting and considering what it had meant to her. She was a deep, reflective thinker, a wonderful amateur historian. In her retirement, she took the opportunity to develop so many of her passions, both for history, for natural, for family and local, as well as her passion for the environment, for plants, for birds and for landscapes. On the 11th of April of 2014, James' first grandchild, Elena, was born, followed by her grandson, Ali, on the 16th of March of 2015, to her eldest son, Mitch. Our children she utterly adored. She cherished and loved dearly. Denise Tabb recalls Jane and I had a magical time in Perth in 2017. visiting her grandchildren, and Jane was simply in her element with the kids. We were planning our next adventure to see the kids in April of this year in Darwin, but sadly not to be, as she so longed to see these beautiful faces again. She just adored them. In 2016, Jane purchased that house in Shelburne just up the road here. It's only just around the corner from her beloved son Tuss and his wife Kerry, with a magnificent wraparound veranda for optimal sunset viewing. Again, Jane set to turning a rundown house in a dry paddock into an oasis, a place where all were welcome and the tea or wine was readily available. On the 5th of June 2017, Jane and Oz's youngest child, Clara, though, sadly passed away. As you would expect, this took a very heavy toll on Jane. This drove Jane to want more people around her, watching the sunset in Shelburne. And Jane had Timbo, Lex and Oscar staying when she was asked, "Does it get easier with time?" And Jane replied, "No, it just gets more familiar." Along the way though, Jane reverently placed little mementos of Clara in special spots, such as tucked into the moss at the base of the ancient tree in Scotland, in the hollow of another in Derby, and high on the hill in Wales, maybe to become part of that fabric of our land, or to be discovered by children. It mattered not. Her annual visit to that Rock of Ages to pay homage with Kerry and Tab were treasured by all, and a special time for women bonding to reflect on the wonderful and dearly loved Hughie. 2019-20, her brother David's partner struggled with serious health issues that meant lots of rest was needed. So not to impose where many would just wait to be called, she drove out their property weekly, delivering cakes and biscuits to the letterbox. Texting news of the delivery to demonstrate her love for her brother was very much so, and with best wishes for her sister-in-law. In her short time at Shelburne, Jane achieved a standing in the community that would take most people more than a lifetime. Jane became friends with many of her neighbours. She started a weekly play group for all of the local children, extended Nuggety land care to include Shelburne, took part in writing a history project on the local schools, took on monitoring the local endangered bird life, the community trial walks, and started work on preserving the history of the local railway. Jane was able to achieve such a great amount in such a short time by installing her enthusiasm into local experts and people around her to achieve that community goal. Jane also worked incredibly hard to keep her family together. Despite the challenges over the past few years, Jane and Oz rebuilt a firm friendship and would regularly have working bees and dinners together. Jane would also host regular family dinners with Oz, with Custer and his wife Kerry, and always ensured everyone knew how Mitch was, who had been living in West Australia and the Northern Territory for many years through their weekly phone calls. There are simply not enough words to describe this magnificent human's entire life. Jane was so honourable. She was always in the moment. She would always give sound advice and considered counsel after extracting the story from you, and had a very special way and a soft way of doing that. It didn't matter if you spoke to Jane every day, every week, or once a year. When you reconnected, it was like not a day had gone past. I think everyone who knew her felt that they were her special friend. Jane was an old soul, a wise girl, wise adolescent, and very wise woman. Her friends and family describe her as a lighthouse, my lighthouse, and a steadying force in my world. We all love her. Our dear Jane, all our love, your family and many, many friends, including these birds that are happily singing in the background for us today. Now I want to invite Christine forward to share one of Jane's poems.
Thank you. Jane had the ability to make everybody think that they were her best friend. She was a teacher, a confidant, a partner in crime. And just to reinforce what Peter said about everybody loving her, even the mail woman who drove past and waved and tooted melted when she heard about Jane passing. I'm really honoured to be able to read this. It's a piece that Jane wrote and dedicated to Clara not long after her death. It's Winter in the Nuggeties, written by Jane and dedicated to her recently departed daughter, Clara Annie Patterson. At Sunnydale, the birds are feeding off the last fruits of the year. Grey currawong, usually too shy to come close, are attracted to the persimmon tree near the back door, along with groups of silver eyes. The pomegranate is a favourite of the crimson rosellas, who tear at the split fruit with their strong beaks to reach the jewels inside. Then the smaller birds can follow now access has been granted. Sunnydale, our home of 32 years, is in the Nuggety Ranges, which lie on the northern side of Maldon. Our European forebears, the Brown family, farmed this site from the time the Nuggety mine commenced in the mid-1850s. They planted fruit trees in this rich 2-acre pocket of land. Thus the pomegranate tree, along with orange, lemon, apple, fig, and a very spectacular and enormous mulberry tree. Surrounding our land is Parks Victoria box bushland. Gullies from the south drain water down the northern slopes, feeding into an underground aquifer, which bubbles up at a small dam on the property. This water, along with a pocket of deep, heavy topsoil, provides rich growth in good years. The surrounding bush provides a bird habitat for over 60 species of birds and counting. The hedge wattles are a favourite safe house for the blue wrens. Kookaburra have advantage points in the grey box and yellow gums to observe for their hunting purposes. Overhead are little eagles, wedge-tailed eagles and brown falcons. There is a constant background soundscape from spotted pardalote. New Holland honeyeaters exert their territorial rights in groups. Family groups of red-browed finches share the bird bath in turns, returning to and fro their bush hideaway. Then there's the seasonal visits from the male and female scarlet robin and black-faced cuckoo shrikes, who had their own particular flight habits. The thornbills twitter and flick through the taller canopies so fast they can hardly be discerned. Crimson rosella's clear ringing call reaches across the valley. My special friend, the grey shrike thrush, is a warming presence. Now the bronze wings and peaceful doves are looking for any leftover ruby saltbush seeds and are helping themselves to fallen pomegranates in their quiet, purposeful manner. After the sun sinks, the dark brings new visitors. A southern boobook call is a low, throaty sound from different vantage points. I hesitate to confirm, but on a few evenings in the past, the single and duet call from barking owls have been heard. We are so fortunate to have this special place to live and share with our feathered friends. Each day I delight in their presence.
Thank you, Christine. Now I want to invite Tufts forward.
I'd like to thank everyone who managed to make it at such short notice this afternoon, and for everyone, the community, Peter, who made it happen so quickly. Obviously only a few hours' notice to pull together what they have today is true testament to, I suppose, the circle of friends and community that Jane had around her, and that everyone just jumped to and made it happen. So thank you everyone. Jane was my mum. I never knew her as mum, always just as Jane. All of us did, Mitch, Clara and myself. Not for any good reason. I think just as kids, she was always just referred to as Jane, not to mum, not as mum. As kids growing up, a lot of my friends thought that was a bit strange, but I always liked it. It was a bit different, but in a good way. I suppose Jane was possibly a little bit different in a good way too. Jane had a habit of changing her mind and making things up on the go. She was certainly very flippant in that regard. You might be on a drive somewhere, let's say we're going to Melbourne. We might get halfway to Melbourne and she'd say, "Oh, I've got a friend in Kyneton. We might just take a detour and you don't mind, do you? We'll just pop in and say hello." That was very much Jane, very much Jane. Or she'd invite us around for dinner. "I'm making a roast chook," she'd say. We'd get round there and she'd serve up lasagna. "Oh, what happened to the roast chook?" And she'd go, "I felt like lasagna," or "I forgot to get the chook." Jane was also great at getting the most out of people, as we've heard from the wonderful eulogy. Thank you, Tab. But she was also very good at getting the most out of her family as well. I know whenever I popped around, just for a visit, or for one of the dinners or something, she'd always have something. "Oh, do you think you could hang a picture up for me? Oh, while you're here, I'll get you to cut this tank in half so I can turn it into a garden bed." Yeah, always kept me on my toes. Most importantly to me, Jane was an amazing parent. I was never left wanting for anything in my whole life. I was always well fed, well looked after, spoilt even. Made time for, and I always knew I was loved. Jane's passing will leave a hole in so many people's lives, including mine, of course. Something I didn't say enough when I had the chance was "I love you, Jane." I'd like to also say a few words on behalf of my wife, Kerry. The first day I met Jane, she welcomed me with open arms and, of course, a hug. It was rare to not get a hug when you saw Jane. Jane was extremely supportive of Tuss and I and encouraged us in all we did. Jane put us in contact with Connecting Country, which saw us receive funding for revegetation on our property. I felt like we were living one of Jane's dreams for her. She was so connected to our land. She would always say, "There's just something about your place, Kerry, it's so calming." Without fail, when Jane would drop me home, we would turn into our driveway and she would say, "You guys have the best view in Sheldon." Jane and I did many things together, including planting hundreds of tube stock on our property and many, many bird walks. I'm going to miss having you around, Jane. I love you.
Now I want to invite Mitch forward.
I'd also like to thank everyone for attending on short notice today. I haven't been as prepared as us, unfortunately. There's only flew in last night, and I haven't managed to put any pen on paper. But I would like to stand here and say that, and back up what Tuss has said today, and how much of a great mother, and she always encouraged us in every way that she could, and somehow she always seemed to make the impossible possible when it comes to doing something. I'd also like to say that she did instill many great values and taught us to love this land and everything that comes with it. She will always be remembered for all the things that she'd done for everyone, and the way she touched everyone and taught everyone how much you can get out of the land that you live on, how much appreciation you can have for the beauty of nature. I'd like to share many stories and memories, but I don't think, and honestly, the 43 years of spending my time with my mother, no matter how far or how close I was to her, she always was there for me, and was there to tell me how everyone else that she visited, whether it be far and wide, how everyone else was going, and very vivid explanations on how everything went. I think sometimes some people will say it's hardest and it's the toughest to be the eldest. I think I was blessed because I spent the first 5 years of my life with my mother in a time where she was very carefree and had abundance of time and knowledge to spend with me. We're all going to miss you, Joe. Thank you.
Thank you, Mitch. I want to invite Oz up now.
Thank you, everyone. I lived with Jane for roughly 30 of the last 40 years. Arguably, I should know her better than any of you, but I don't. I'm an introvert. Jane is an extrovert. Jane had a breadth and a depth that I think defied any of us knowing all of them. Today, we're hearing from people who were the people that she used to find that depth and that breadth. As people have talked, as more people will talk, we'll all get to know more of them. Thank you all.
Thank you, Oz. I want to invite Tab up now. All right.
Jane would be horrified that I'm reading off my phone today. I didn't have time to print. Apologies, Jane. What an absolute legend. Just an incredible, beautiful human. I look out at all the lives you've touched, and it's everything to our family. Thank you. I'm so incredibly proud to be your niece, but I felt more like a daughter. I hope that you know that. You found a light in me that I couldn't find. Thank you for picking me. I went to your beautiful house and sat on your veranda, the place where we sat and looked out on the beautiful world that you showed me. Your view of the world shaped my world. Love the strong woman that you I wanted in on that powerful bunch of women. I look up to you all. Bushy, Carol, the tribe. I loved hearing the stories. I wanted in such strong leaders. Your view of the world made me connect to my child in a way that I would never have found without you. A secret garden of play. I'm forever grateful. Thank you also to your neighbours, who we have fed countless carrots to, your horses. Thank you for that. My child absolutely loved it. We spoke weekly, and the last time you expressed your love for Clara, Tuss and Mitch, we were planning our trip to see Mitch, Ange and the kids again in April. You were so excited. You just loved them so much. I'm so grateful that last conversation I got to tell you that I loved you and vice versa. We have the same hands. I spend every day looking at them. Thanks for that little gift. Something to remind me of you. I was looking up the sky for you, Jane. I saw the clouds. You were the brightest one at the front. And under your wing you had Clara. And it was funny because this cloud had little clouds absorbed into it, and that was you, just bringing everybody under your wing. The next night I saw flocks of birds, again staring out looking for you. And after this performance that you put on for me, Jane, gosh, you've got so many people to visit down here. Thank you for that gift. I'm not religious, but I've always been afraid of dying, but knowing that you will be there to guide me makes me at ease. And knowing that you are holding our beautiful Clara, again, who needs you so much, is what you needed to be home. All of our moments I'll never replace. I can't wait to hold your hand again, but in the meantime, I'll pause to hear the birds, I'll pause to love all, I'll pause to look up at the stars and wonder which one you are.
Thank you, Tab. Now we'll invite Tim forward.
Goodness, how do you follow that? My name's Tim, I'm Jane's younger brother. I think you'll all appreciate how difficult it is to accept the reason why we're all here today. Jane was supposed to outlive us all. And the knowledge that she's no longer with us will take some time to understand, especially considering she was someone so full of life. I've been writing emails to our relatives with the news. Sorry to let you know my sister Jane has passed away. I need to reread the email before hitting the send button. But the words, they make no sense. They don't belong in the same sentence. So to try to make some sense of things that don't make sense, sometimes we apply a toolbox of things that we know and that we love, and things that we're familiar with. And for me, that's music, and a lifelong love of music, and especially discovering new music. So I'm going to share with you some thoughts on that. A couple of years ago, I was introduced to the music of an Australian-born composer whose name was Frederick Septimus Kelly. He was born in Sydney in 1881. He was educated at Oxford and he studied music and composition in Frankfurt. In April 1915, he, along with a group of his friends, including the British poet Rupert Brooke, were on a troop ship heading towards Gallipoli. Rupert Brooke died on board from septicemia caused by an infection from a mosquito bite, and he was buried on the Greek island of Skiros. Septimus Kelly was so distraught at the death of his close friend that he wrote a musical work titled Elegy in Remembrance of Rupert Brooke. It's a very beautiful piece of music, and for those of you who are so inclined, I encourage you to look it up because you will be greatly rewarded. More recently, I was listening to the radio. A piano piece was playing. I wasn't familiar with it, but it was beautiful, and I was enjoying it very much. Then the music suddenly stopped. The radio announcer revealed it was a piano sonata by Frederick Septimus Kelly. It was unfinished as he was killed in France in November 1916. Jane has stopped. Jane wasn't ready to go gentle into that good night. So like that beautiful piece of music, Jane's life is unfinished. The busy and endless list of projects and things that she always had on the go. There's knitting projects, there was house improvements, working in her garden, working in other people's gardens. There's a pile of new unopened voice recorders sitting on her desk for the oral history projects. There's jams and preserves to be made. There's a huge group of wonderful friends with plans for catch-ups and visits. The Landcare group, the birdwatching group, the walking group, the pop-up children's play group, and her family. Always keeping in touch, always wanting to know how you're doing. There were books and newspapers to read, politics to discuss, meals and wine to share. The kettle was always ready for that cup of tea. Jane was always curious. She could always want to know what was about the world around her, and if she didn't know something, she would put in the effort to find out. She could name dozens, probably more than dozens, of species of plant by their Latin binomial. And over the last few years, her newest pursuit, being bird watching, in a few short years she could identify dozens of species of birds just from their calls. Her gardens weren't just productive, they were also beautiful. I think we can all agree that there is always room for more beauty in this world. So we are all better people for having known Jane, and that is because of her generosity and the time that she would take to spend with us all. So if you choose to celebrate her life, do so by trying to create beauty in whatever you do, and always try to stay curious. We farewell Jane with the dirt still under her fingernails, and the earth receives an honoured guest. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Tim. I do know there's a couple others that were wanting to share a word or two, so they're most welcome to come up now.
Hello, I'm Carol, and I'm about to repeat a lot of what you've already heard, but guess what? Too bad. I met Jane at Brownies, and I overheard her telling our Brownow that she was moving to 36 Friendship Square. I piped up and said, I live right near there, and so began our lifetime friendship. Jane was 7 years old and I was 8. That was 58 years ago. That's a long time, yes, but not nearly long enough. Jane was not only a dear friend, but she was also a steadying force throughout the years. And yes, she held me accountable for myself. For that, I truly thank her. It was a valuable early life lesson. Jane was my lighthouse in a storm, and there were plenty of those over 58 years. You could tell Jane anything, and she always heard you, and gave sound and considered advice or suggestions. after, of course, extracting from you the whole story. She had a very special way of drawing out information, even when she was very young, long before her formal training in that field. Jane and I were very, very different and often had opposing views, but that was never a barrier in our friendship. She always saw the good in people, even if they had wronged her in some ways. She never held a grudge. There wasn't a mean or bitter bone in her body. Jane never ever lost that sense of curiosity and wonder that we all possessed as children, especially for the natural world. When her granddad Mitchell was old, living alone and becoming a little frail, she visited to spend some time with him. She bypassed the stove that needed cleaning and the floor that needed mopping, both unimportant in her world. Instead, she cleaned his windows, opened the curtains wide and gave him a sparkling view of the garden and the outside world. As kids were more old enough to cross the busy road, my mum would bake the scones and Jane and I would skip down to spend time with my great auntie Peg, about 2 kilometres away, and we'd spend hours there. Jane loved the stories of the old folk that the old folk had to share. That love of history and stories from those who had lived that history was to remain with Jane for the rest of her life. And then it was me that coined the phrase Jane's Jolly Joint. You start going for a walk and you could end up anywhere. I wonder what's around that corner. I wonder what's over that hill. I wonder. Instead of taking the hour or two you're expecting, it could take all day. I could wax lyrical for a very long time about our Jane, but I won't. You all know her qualities. The list is long. Her open mind, her open heart, her open door, and her open arms. Old friends are gold friends, and Jane was solid gold. And now for a very short poem by somebody called Aldi Stevenson. Live decently, tick, fearlessly, tick, joyously, tick. And don't forget, in the long run, it is not the years in your life, but the life in your years that count. Ballet, my lovely, ballet.
Hi everybody. Hello everybody. For those of you that don't know me, my name's Marisa, or as Jane would call me, M. Little E, big M, and that was her coin of phrase. I met Jane in early 1997 when we both started working as welfare workers in the social work department at Bendigo Health. Although we were as alike as chalk and cheese, Jane and I struck up an almost instant friendship that was to last and strengthen over many years. Jane was an amazing welfare worker. She was a team player. She was a strong advocate for those who would come under her care on the rehabilitation ward at Bendigo Health, and later in her role as a case manager. As you've heard other people say, she was great at extracting stories from anybody and everybody that came under her wing. To encompass in this short tribute the essence of who and what Jane was to her patients, to her family, to me, to friends, to those who she knew, who knew her and who she loved and cared about, is difficult. But a few words to embody this do come to mind. Jane was the following and more. Jane was passionate, honest, loyal, hardworking, imaginative, dedicated, diligent, articulate, intelligent, resourceful and generous, and particularly generous of herself. As others have said, Jane had an inquiring mind, and it was this that intrigued me about her. We could talk for hours about many and varied things, and never did we get bored with each other's company. We would have conversations 2 or 3 times a week on the telephone, and I would often spend time at Shelburne, and Jane would come across to me and stay with me in Creswick. She gave so much of herself. Her heart was open, and she asked for nothing in return. Jane and I went on to work closely together for many years, both on the rehabilitation wards and travelling into the region, where we would offer information and education in relation to our work. Some small diversions were had on our trips away, as you've heard from other people. She was good at it. We'd do our work and then she'd say, how about we go and find where Ultima is? And I'd say, Ultima, and she'd say, yes. Isn't that where your lady on the ward came from? And she was waiting for the bus at the nurses' station to take her to Ultima. We'd laugh. We'd have some wonderful times, some wonderful adventures. These adventures were, as I said, mostly related to a story a patient had told one of us. We would seek out the history of their beloved hometown, which was often almost now non-existent, and then put it together with the story the patient had shared with one or other of us. As I think you mentioned earlier, Jane had an intrigue with cemeteries, yeah, and that was often on the list of to-dos in remote small towns. Old rose cuttings were also to be sought, as they were no longer available in nurseries. And one particular rose cutting we took from from Tokemol. Jane didn't know the name of it, she couldn't remember what it was called, but from the time she brought it home and put some at Nuggety and some then at Shelburne, she called it the Tokemol rose. It now grows in her garden at Shelburne. Just a little couple of things, if you'll bear with me, but just to say that the lunchroom at the social work department was a haven for all of us. Everybody gravitated to there. Nobody missed out on lunchtime. It provided a venue for all of us and provided much discussion and debate at times. Jane, known for often voicing strong opinions and me goading her into further debate, then the whole lunchroom laughing, including Jane. Sharing food was a given for most of us. And one thing that Jane will be fondly remembered for is her love of all foods. We would often cut a cake in half and not eat half. Jane would race into the lunchroom ravenous, and everybody would look at each other and we'd say, she's going to do it. And sure enough, she would eat that other half. Never did it fail. Lunchtime walks, collecting nature's bits and pieces along the way, and admiring the beautiful Victorian houses that we would pretend to own. And then talking about how we would spend our time together when we retired, sitting on the verandas and having morning tea and making scones. One thing that I'm hopeless at, and I think Jane could make scones. Sadly, Jane left the social work department to pursue a career in case management services, which she also excelled at. Often my patient on the ward was also Jane's client in the community. how wonderful it was to know that Jane would pull out all stops to get my patient, her client, home. She made my job so much easier. I missed her constant presence, but our friendship continued and never wavered. Now I, like many, will miss her once again, more than ever. I'm lucky to have had Jane in my life. Her support, strength, kindness, friendship, caring and open heart. And I am honoured to have been able to offer her support in return when she too needed that support. Although our journey as we knew it has ended, and we won't be using our train travel vouchers, Jane, this year, that were to be used to continue our adventures. It's only temporary. We'll catch up at a later time. I love you, Jane. Jane is my friend. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing all those wonderful tributes here today. It is pretty easy to speak of someone who's so special to all of us. We all share so many wonderful and beautiful memories of our times with Jane. Take those memories with you. Always cherish them and always hold them very close to your hearts. We're now going to leave and go across the cemetery for those that want to come. Otherwise, you're most welcome to go your own way from here. But again, on behalf of Jane's family, thank you all so much at such short notice for being able to be here to share this tribute together. Thank you all. Please stand.
He's a walker